Hi everyone, welcome to the Psychometric Test webinar for practice questions and solutions. I published another webinar recently, which is really a webinar surrounding psychometric tests, but a broad overview of what psychometric tests are, why employers use them. That webinar gives some general advice and specific advice for different types of psychometric tests. If you haven't watched that webinar already, I definitely go and recommend you watch that first and then come back and watch this webinar, as this webinar will be focusing particularly on practice questions and solutions. It won't be delving into specific or general advice about psychometric tests. So it's definitely worthwhile you going watching that webinar first, coming back and then having a go at these practice questions and solutions. This webinar will last approximately 1 hour. So it's important to take breaks throughout. Feel free to pause the webinar at any point, just to ensure that you're absorbing all the information, as there will be a lot of practice questions and a lot of solutions as well. So there's a lot of information in this webinar, so it's important you take your time with it, and most importantly, approach and go through the webinar at a comfortable pace for you. So feel free, and I'd recommend you take breaks throughout the webinar. There also will be an option to adjust the playback speed as well. So if you think I'm going through any of the examples too quickly, then feel free to slow the playback speed of the video. So just starting with the different types of psychometric tests, I won't go into this too much, but there's two main types. There's aptitude tests, which are also known as ability tests. And then there's three main types of ability tests, which are logical, numerical, and verbal reasoning. And each of these have their own subsets of tests. And then the other branch, we have personality tests, and the main type of personality test is a situational judgment test. So in this webinar, I aim to provide practice questions for each of these types of test. And the number of questions for each type of test will vary on how common they appear in your application processes for graduate schemes, placement years, and summer internships. As I said, there will be several questions for each type of psychometric test that I've just mentioned on the previous slide. And for example, with numerical reasoning tests, which is a very common type of psychometric test that you'll come up against, there will be 4 practice questions. However, with word relationship tests, which aren't that common, there will only be 1 practice question. See this webinar also as an opportunity to have a go at home. I think that will really be the best way to approach this webinar, and it'll become interactive for yourselves. The best way to do this is pause the question as it comes up on the screen, have a go at that question. If you want to time yourself, even better, and then resume the webinar to see how our workings differed, if they differed at all, and if you got the correct answer. But I'm more concerned with you understanding the solutions that I'm going through and you're understanding how I've got from point A to point B, rather than you necessarily getting the correct answer. And as I've mentioned, I will be going into clear solutions for each question that I go through. So to get on with it really, and onto the first practice question, which is a numerical reasoning question. So with numerical reasoning tests, there's 4 main question types. You have exchange rate questions, you have questions regarding percentage change, percentage increase, and ratios. So they're the 4 main question types you will come up against, and therefore they are the 4 types of questions I will include in this webinar. Of course, there will be more to your numerical reasoning test than just these 4 question types, but if you can do them 4 question types well, you're well on your way to doing well in your numerical reasoning tests. So the first question is an exchange rate question. Now, it is tricky, and don't be alarmed. We'll go through this quite slowly and in a way that's most understandable for everyone. As I said, if you want to have a go at this question now, this would be a good time to pause and then resume the webinar once you've got some kind of answer. So with numerical reasoning questions, a question that I get asked a lot is, what is the best way to approach these questions? Do I read the table or the graph first, or do I read the question first? Now, obviously the strategy is up to you, and find a way that's comfortable with you, but the way I would recommend going about numerical reasoning questions is to read the question first. Now, there's two main reasons for this. Firstly, the tables and graphs given to you in numerical reasoning questions are often very complex in the information given. There's often a lot of data in them, and secondly, there's a lot of that data will not be relevant to the question you are answering. In fact, there will only be a few pieces of information within a particular graph or table that you will necessarily need to answer that question. So, is there a point deliberating and trying to understand all the information in the table or the graph, only then to look at the question and realize you didn't need to know or understand a lot of that information? Therefore, I'd recommend you look at the question first, understand what information you need to extract from a particular table or graph, and then to look at the table or graph and extract that information that you need. It's a much more efficient process, and it also ticks the box in ensuring that you are doing something that the employers want you to do in these questions, which is not only demonstrate strong numerical ability, but demonstrate the ability to pick out the relevant pieces of information in a complex data set, which is often what a lot of these questions are. And even if the table or the graph isn't that complex, it's often loaded just with a lot of volume of numbers and lines often, which a lot, like I said, a lot of which you just don't need to know. So we'll apply that strategy with this particular question, and I'll demonstrate how much easier it is. So just reading the question first. So a trader buys rupees with £15,000 sterling at today's high rate. What is the maximum amount of yen the trader could buy with these rupees on this trading day? So it's a two-part question, so we'll tackle the first part of the question first. So we know the question's asking us about rupees, sterling, and it's asking us about yen. There's no mention of US dollars or the euro. And it's also asking us to focus specifically on today's high rate. So if you look along the top of the table, you'll see 4 different exchange rates and a change on the day. We need to focus on today's high. So therefore, based on that information, we can eliminate most and the majority of information from that table. I've left there the today's high rate for the sterling, and I've left some options for the yen, the currency options for the yen. So just going around the first part of the question, and the crucial bit we need to understand is the little bit below the table, which says that rates are number of rupee per stated currency. Okay, so we need to first work out how many rupees is equivalent to £15,000 of sterling. We know from the table that £1 of sterling is equal to 56.85 rupees. So I got this from looking at the sterling row at the top and going 2 columns in from the left, and we get 56.85. And then to work out how many rupees is £15,000 sterling, we simply multiply 15,000 times 56.85, which leads us to 852,750 rupees. So that's the first part of the question done. Now we can move on to the second part, which is asking us what's the maximum amount of yen we could buy with this amount of rupees, i.e. the 852,750 rupees. You'll see in the bottom row there's several currency and exchange rate options available to us. We have the closing point, 0.32, today's high of 0.34, and then the today's low and World Bank Index are both 0.30. So we need to select the best exchange rate conversion, and by that I mean the exchange rate conversion that will allow us to purchase the maximum amount of yen using the 852,750 rupees we have. And mathematically this must be the lowest number. So I'm going to use in this particular case today's low, which is equivalent to the World Bank Index. So to do the conversion between rupees and yen, we do 852,750 divided by 0.3. which gives us an answer of 2,842,500. So hopefully that question made sense. Go over it again, rewind the webinar if you need to go through that again, and we'll move on to the second question for numerical reasoning, which is a percentage change question. Now, based on what I've just said in the last question, you might want to have a go at this question differently now. Perhaps read the question first if you didn't already in the last question, and then try to extract the information you need from the graph, which is what I'm going to do again. So this question is asking is what was the percentage change in revenue for graph from Q1 to Q4? So looking at the table, there's different lines. We have revenue in thousands on the y-axis, and we have some time periods on the x-axis. And then we have 4 companies, I assume. Graph, if we look, is the orange line. So we need to ignore the blue, black, and the green line. We just need to focus on the orange line. And we need to focus on Q1 and Q4, which is January to March and October to December. So we need to use a formula for any percentage change question. I'd recommend using this formula, which is A minus B over A times 100. Generally, it will work, and it should work for every type of percentage change question you get. In this particular question, A is 15,000. So, or for simplicity, we'll add the 3 zeros on at the end. We can just work with simpler numbers. So, for example, A is 15 in this case, which is the Q1 figure. B is 30, which is the Q4 figure. We need to calculate the percentage change in revenue between these 2 quarters that we're asked. So we plug the numbers in. 15 minus 30, all divided by 15 times 100 equals 100%. Now, this formula is great, and you should try to use it as much as you can, but it will sometimes give negative answers just because of how it's programmed. Obviously, just use your common sense in this situation. For example, in this particular question, I plugged the numbers in and I got minus 100%, but I know it can't actually be minus 100% because the revenue has increased from 15,000 to 30,000. So it's not possible for it to be minus 100%. So in this case, just use your common sense, and just a lot of the time, if it's a percentage change question where there's an increase, of course, just ignore the little negative sign that your calculator gives you. So that's the answer, 100%. Fairly straightforward question, and that formula is really quick and easy to use for any percentage change question you might have. This question's a bit trickier, and it's a percentage change question. So from April, the production of quality A diamonds is expected to increase by 12% per month cumulatively. What is the predicted production figure for June in carats? So again, there's a lot of information in this graph that we don't need. Firstly, we need to focus on quality A diamonds, which is the blue line, so we can just kind of ignore every single orange and black line that we see, and we need to focus on April, it's the blue line next to April is the one that we really need to be focusing on. That's the only piece of information we need. So the production of quality A diamonds in April was 10,000 carats. So hopefully that makes sense. I've just gone across and look downwards, and it's at 10, the blue line. It's touching the 10,000 line. We need to calculate how much the quality A diamonds are expected to increase by 12% per month for 2 months, i.e. we need to calculate it a 12% increase from April to May and then May to June. So it's a 2-period increase. And the way we do this is by doing 10,000 times 1.12 times 1.12. Now, you might be thinking, where have I got 1.12 from? So let me explain. So for percentage increase questions, you need to put 1 point, whatever number you want to increase by. So in this particular case, it was 12%, so it was 1.12. If it was you wanted to increase by 5%, it would be 1.05. If you wanted to increase by 50%, it would be 1.50. So it's simply you just put 1 point followed the number you want to increase by. And because in this case it wanted to do it for June, I had to then do another round of calculation, another 1.12 to get 12,544 carats. So the last numerical reasoning example question, and this one's a mixture of percentage decrease and ratios. So this question's asking us if the number of giraffes at Congton, which is a zoo, were reduced by 63%, what would the approximate ratio of giraffes at Congton to animals at Congton, the other category, be? So again, this is a table with a lot of information we don't need. We need to focus on Congton, and we need to focus on giraffes at Congton and other animals at Congton. So we can eliminate most of the information and focus on them 2 numbers that are left in the table. The number of giraffes at Congton are 124, and we want to reduce this number by 63%. How we do this is we do 124 times 0.37. Now, remember from the last question, if we wanted to increase by something, we do 1 point that number. So in the last question, it was 1.12. If we want to reduce by something, we have to do 124, the number that you want to reduce by, times 0.1 minus the number. So I've got 0.37 by doing 1 minus 0.63. So it'd be 124 times 0.37 equals to 45.88. Again, if we wanted to reduce by 5%, let's say, it would be 124 times 0.95, because we would have to do 1 minus 0.5, which gives us 0.95. So just do, it's always going to be a 0 point something if you're reducing. And the number that's going to be after the 0 point is determined by doing 1 minus what the number is you want to reduce by. In this case, it's 63. So that leaves us with 45.88 giraffes. The number of other animals at Congton is 108. So our ratio, which is the question is asking us to do, is 45.88 giraffes to 108 other animals. Great, we have the ratio, but we need to simplify that into a more digestible format. There's several ways of doing this, and you will have your own method, but the particular method I used is dividing both sides by 100, which would give us 0.4588 to 1.08. And then to simplify it even further, dividing the 0.4588 and 1.08 by 0.4588 to give us 1 to 2.35. So it's in a much clearer and simpler format now, and something that we can work with. Now you'll see that 1.235 isn't an option in the table, isn't an option in the answers, sorry. And there's a reason for that. The question wants you to kind of experiment with this and see what 1.21 to 2.35 is equivalent to from the options given. So it's not A, as that's 1 to 2. It's not B, as that's 1 to 3. It's not C, as that's 2 to 3. It's actually D, 3 to 7. So if you try to do that, so if we did 1 times 3, which would give it 3, and if you do 2.35 times 3, that would actually give you 7. So a lot of the time you would get a ratio and the answer would be there waiting for you in the multiple choice section. However, in this case, it was there, but it was in a different format. So you just need to, the key with this question was just to really experiment with the numbers that you've been given. So that concludes numerical reasoning. Hopefully you found them questions useful and you understood them. If not, go back and rewatch some of them and have a go again. So we're moving on now to verbal reasoning practice questions, which is a common question type that you will come up against in psychometric tests. Not so common as as numerical reasoning tests, but still will appear inevitably in some of your application processes. So comprehension-based verbal reasoning questions are the most common type of verbal reasoning practice question you will get. So you will have a statement, which in this case is at the top, and then you will have a passage. And then based on the information in the passage, you need to determine whether that statement is true, false, or you cannot say. Now, the real trick and something that you really need to focus and ensure you do in verbal reasoning questions, which are comprehension based, is focus purely on the information given to you in the passage. This isn't a test of general knowledge. Verbal reasoning questions are really testing your ability to understand the information given to you and, draw the facts out of that and be able to skim information quickly and really focus on what's the information that's on the screen in front of you. So therefore, it's important not to bring in any knowledge. It's important not to make any overriding assumptions either. So let's have a go at this question with that in mind. Saturday evenings are a time when many families would be tempted to indulge in junk food. Now, the passage says about charities, it says about petition, and it has the final paragraph is further about the petitions as well. But the particular piece of information we need to focus on is the last few lines of the first paragraph, which state, the current regulations restrict junk food adverts from being shown during children's programming, but there's nothing to stop them from being shown during popular family slots, such as Saturday evenings, when many children watch television with their families. So from this information, we know that junk food adverts cannot be shown during children's shows. That's correct. That's a fact. But they can be shown during popular family slots, such as Saturday evenings. And Saturday evenings are a time when families sit down together, including the children, and watch television with their families. So there is a possibility that children will be exposed to these junk food adverts on Saturday nights. However, does this imply, or does it say anywhere in particular, specifically, that Saturday evenings are a time when many families would necessarily be tempted to indulge in junk food? No. All we know is that families, there's a decent enough chance that families would be exposed to these adverts. But there's nothing about stating about families' temptation then to indulge in this junk food. All we can conclude from the information given to us is that families may be exposed to these adverts. There's nothing to say that families would then be tempted to indulge in this junk food. That's an assumption that we are making if we were to think that. And like I said, it's important to stick to the facts in verbal reasoning questions, and therefore the answer is cannot say, because without any further information given to us, we cannot determine for certain whether families would be tempted to indulge in junk food. And at the same time, there's nothing to say that they definitely don't, so the answer is false. So the answer is cannot say. We need further information to fully determine whether the statement is true or false. But with critical reasoning questions, which are the second most common type of verbal reasoning questions, it's not so much about whether a statement is true, false, or cannot say. It's more if a conclusion follows or conclusion does not follow. And the ruling is usually, if you think that a conclusion follows beyond reasonable doubt, which is the key bit, then choose conclusion follows. So you don't have to be 100% certain in this particular case. It's just about whether you think the statement follows regarding and based on the passage beyond reasonable doubt. Then choose conclusion follows. And of course, if you don't think it does, choose conclusion does not follow. This in mind, we'll have a go at critical reasoning question. The statement says Tajikistan was an observer state before becoming a member. Now, again, quite a lot of information there. The bit we need to focus on is that line, which gives the answer away. Accession to membership involves an application which involves becoming an observer state prior to accession. So even though it's not specifically said in the passage anywhere that Tajikistan in particular was definitely an observer state before becoming a member, we do know from the passage that to become a member, states must have been an observer state before becoming a member. Therefore, Tajikistan is a state. Therefore, Tajikistan must have also been an observer state before becoming a member. So therefore, the conclusion follows. Another critical reasoning practice question, a bit more tricky. So a minority of staff are required to wear steel cap boots at the work site. So first bit of information we need to focus on is all members of staff are legally entitled to join a trade union, but most do not. So from this, to put it into simpler terms, the majority of staff are not members of a trade union, okay? And then the second sentence we need to focus on is only non-union affiliated staff are not required to wear steel cap boots at the work site. So it's a bit of a mouthful, and it's probably deliberately like that for you to kind of simplify it yourself. But what this is saying essentially is those who are not part of a trade union don't have to wear steel cap boots. Therefore, those that are part of a trade union have to wear steel cap boots. However, we know that those who are part of a trade union are the minority because the majority don't join a trade union. Therefore, a minority of staff, which is those who are part of a trade union, are required to wear steel cap boots at the work site. So again, the conclusion follows. But with this particular question, you have to put two different sentences together and view them as one in order to get to the correct answer. So we'll quickly go through a word relationship question. And these verbal reasoning questions are not too common at all. Again, though, it's important that in case it does come up, you know how to answer them properly. So in this particular type of question, you will be presented with two words. In this particular case, it's court is to judge, as classroom is to, and then you have four options. So the best way to go around about these questions is to determine the relationship between the first pair of words. So court is to judge. What's the relationship between them two? There's two ways of thinking about it. Firstly, who is in charge of a court? A judge. By that same logic, who is in charge of a classroom? A teacher. So that's one way that you could have got to your answer. A second way is, what is the main working place of a judge? Like, i.e., where does he spend the most of his working time? In a court, surely. And same with the teacher. Where is their main working hub? Where do they go to work? It's a classroom. So that's another way that you can kind of determine the link between it. But the main thing to remember is that determining the relationship between the first two pair of words is the most important thing to do before you even look at the second pair of words and what the options are for them. Now, deductive reasoning, it's a type of logical reasoning practice question. And logical reasoning is composed of abstract reasoning, inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, and diagrammatic reasoning. And there'll be a question type and practice question for each of these question types. So deductive reasoning differs from the other ones because it doesn't include any shapes, whereas the other questions, as you will see, do a lot of the time. So this question is asking us, on the left-hand side, if you want to focus first, is it's given us some facts, and it's asking us, based on them facts, which of the information on the right must definitely be true. So we have 4 facts and we have 5 potential options, and one of them options is definitely true. So let's go through these. The first one is Jane lives in New York. Now, we know Jane drives a red car, but there's no mention of, where Jane lives in particular. But importantly, we know she drives a red car, but there's no red cars in New York. So Jane cannot possibly live in New York. So in fact, A is not just not definitely true, it's definitely false. B, Susan lives in New York. So all we know about Susan is she drives a blue car. There's nothing said about where Susan lives, so there's not enough information for us to confirm B is definitely true, as there's no information provided on where Susan lives. C is red cars get 36 miles per gallon of petrol. All we know is about red cars is that there's none in New York and Jane drives one. Nothing at all said about what their efficiency is and what their miles per gallon is. So there's not enough information to confirm C is true. Now with D, it says Susan's car gets 33 miles per gallon of petrol. Now, from the facts, Susan drives a blue car, and blue cars get 33 miles per gallon of petrol. Therefore, Susan's car must get 33 miles per gallon of petrol. So D is the answer, and D is the one out of all these options that is definitely true. And with E, Jane and Susan live in the same state. Just to confirm that this isn't the one that's definitely true, there's no information provided on where either Jane or Susan live. There's a possibility Jane might live in New York. Susan might live in New York. Jane definitely can't because she has a red car and there's no red cars in New York. But There's nothing really said whether either of them definitely live or whether they're in the same state or not. So D was the correct answer here. So this is a typical inductive reasoning practice question. You're given a sequence and you're giving a missing space, and you need to determine what is the missing space from the answers provided to you. Now, starting from left to right, I want everyone to go about logical reasoning questions and inductive reasoning questions by focusing on rules. So rules being, for example, a shape might move clockwise one space, it might turn from a triangle to a circle, it might increase in size, it might become shaded and then become unshaded. It can do multiple things, and there's multiple rules. And the key thing is to focus from one sequence to the next. So one box to the next, rather than looking at the whole sequence as a whole, because then it can be quite overwhelming to spot a pattern. And the trick to these questions is about spotting patterns as quickly as possible. So if we focus from left to right, just one box at a time. So the first rule I can determine is that the outer circle, which is the thicker, I think that's a black, dark blue circle, dark blue line, is rotating around 45 degrees anti-clockwise every sequence. And then the inner circle, which is the thinner orange line, is rotating 90 degrees clockwise every sequence. So them are the two rules here. There's no other rules, and them are the only two patterns. So based on the position of the two lines in the second box, we need to, so the outer circle we know must rotate another 45 degrees anti-clockwise. So that will be facing in a direction that's more to the left. And we know the inner circle is going to rotate another 90 degrees clockwise as well. So the answer is B, as that's the only one that fits the two rules. So if you go about the sequences by comparing box to box, it'll be much easier for you to answer the question. Apply the same logic here as well. Have a go at this question and try to identify the rule or the rules in this question, and it'll become a lot easier to get the answer. So the one real rule here is that the number of sides is decreasing by 2 every box we go along. So with the star on the left, it's 10, and then we move to 8, then we move to 6, and then we move to 2 after the box that we're after. So if it's moved from 10, 8, 6, so it must be a 4-sided shape. That is the box in question that we're looking for. And from A, B, C, and D, the only one that is a 4-sided shape is B. So that is the correct answer here. Now this is a tricky question, and this was one that got through me a lot, and it was difficult to spot the rules here. So here the rules are there's 2 main rules, in fact. So the first one is that a diagonal line is disappearing and then it is added again. So you'll see in the far left box there's 3 diagonal lines, and then there's 2, and then there's the hidden box, and then there's 0, and then there's 1, and then there's 2. So it's decreasing until it gets to 0, and then it's increasing again. And the second rule is that a horizontal bar is being added every sequence, as every box as we go along. So we've got 1 diagonal, so we've got 1 horizontal bar, then we have 2, then we have 4, etc. So based on that, the box that we're looking for has to have, firstly, it has to have 1 diagonal line. So we can eliminate A, B, and F. So it must be C, D, or E. And it must have 3 horizontal bars, which only leaves us with 1 option, and that's C. So the answer is C. A tricky question, difficult to spot the rules, as it's not really a common rule anywhere in this sequence. There's no shape change in the number of sides. There's no shaded changes. There's no shapes necessarily moving around the boxes. It's quite obscure to identify how this is a pattern, but this is where focusing on one box at a time and focusing on particular patterns at the same time and identifying the rules becomes so important. and an abstract reasoning question. So as you will have noticed, abstract reasoning, diagrammatic reasoning, and inductive reasoning tend not to differ too much. So they are all types of logical reasoning practice questions, and they won't really differ too much in their difficulty also as well. So here we have a triangle, a square, and then a pentagon. And we need to determine the relationship here. It's really quite difficult to do, but I want you to focus and go through this, moving from left to right to left to right. So I want you to move from the triangle to the square to the pentagon. So left to right and then move down the row. So rule 1 is that the sides of shape is increasing by 1. So we move from a 3-sided shape to a 4 to a 5. And rule 2 is that the arrow direction is alternating between downwards, upwards, downwards, and then in our box it must be upwards. So we can eliminate kind of A, B, and C, as not only do they have an arrow that's downwards, but they are not a 6-sided shape, which is the side of the shape that we're after, because we're looking for 1 up from 5, of course, 6. So it has to be, D is the only one that ticks both criteria. So the answer is D. This question was tricky in the sense that when you look at the sequence, it's hard to know which direction you need to be following the pattern in. Do you start at the triangle and then move downwards, or do you move at the start of the triangle and move rightwards? It's difficult to know exactly. Now on to the final type of practice test, which is a situational judgment test. Now, these are probably, along with numerical reasoning test, the most common type of test you will come up against in your application processes and in psychometric tests. And what they are is they put you into a scenario, which is a scenario that you will likely come up against on the job that you are applying for. And the scenario, there will be an issue at hand, and you'll be given several responses, and you need to decide and weigh up these responses and select either the most effective and least effective course of action, or you need to rank these responses from 1 to 4 or 1 to 5, depending on what you'd most likely do and least likely do. Now, with this particular question, we've got a passage, as you would in any situation judgment test question. And we need to, before doing anything else, we need to really determine what is the issue at hand here. There'll always be a lot of information given to you in the passage, which is it's always worth fully reading the passage that you're given, as there's always useful information in there. However, not every piece of information, not every sentence will be useful. There'll be a lot of contextual information, but the underlying point is that there'll always just be one specific fundamental issue at hand. And before you even look at the potential responses, I think it's so important for you to understand what this issue is. And I'll explain why this is so important later on. In this particular question, I'm not going to read through the entire passage, but please, I want you to do that before you go any further, is how can I spread complex, ever-changing information widely across a business which is geographically sparse? Now, just a bit of context, hopefully you've read the passage yourself, but basically you're on a placement. You need to find a way to spread technical information widely across a business which is located in different parts of the country, it seems. So this is the fundamental issue at hand. It's not an easy task. It's not easy to find a way to spread this information in an effective manner to different departments who are located around the country, especially when the information that you're trying to spread is complex and it's changing constantly. But this is the issue at hand. Now, I feel it's so important to understand the issue before you move on to responses, because your decisions of what your answers should be determined by how effectively does that response help and best solve the issue at hand. If a particular response you might think is the best response, however, you need to think to yourself, will this response help to solve the issue at hand, or will it, think of it relatively, how well will it help to solve the issue at hand relative to the other responses that I am presented with? Okay. Them are the responses. Now, keep in mind the issue at hand, which I've left on the screen at the top right, and take some time to go through them responses yourself, and really decide which is the most effective and least effective course of action. So this is what you need to select, or in other words, what would you most likely and least likely do. So you don't need to rank them. You just need to select two responses. So the correct answers here are 4 is most likely, or in other words, most effective, and 3 is least likely, in other words, least effective. So let's start with 4. Suggest that a new technology forum group is created that meets regularly. Offer to chair it and invite representatives from all departments across the business along with key experts from the technical team. The remit of the group will be to continually disseminate information more widely across the business. Now, what's really good about 4 is that this technology forum it's interactive for a start. It can be regularly updated, which helps to solve the issue of you're trying to spread information that constantly needs updating. You're offering to chair it, which is great. You're showing initiative, and most importantly, you're inviting representatives from departments across the business. And this is important because one of your objectives and one of the issues at hand is you need to spread this information across the business and make it widespread. Now, the way to do this, and a great way to do it, is invite representatives from all departments across the business. And one of your objectives, and the final line states, the remit of the group will be to continually disseminate information widely across the business. Again, showing that you're trying to solve the issue at hand, which is the issue is that you need to find a way to spread this information widely. And again, this is one of the key objectives of point 4. So 4 is a brilliant answer, helps to solve the issue at hand. You're showing initiative, and you're really coming up with a kind of a clever way to go about solving the issue. Now 3, why is 3 the worst, would you say? Agree to write a simple report that outlines the key advances in technology that are impacting the manufacturing process in the business. Okay, so the report, the fundamental issue with the report, firstly, and most fundamentally in this question, is it's not very interactive. You're trying to spread information that people will understand and they'll engage with, and a report can be quite boring and very simplistic to kind of understand. So agreeing to writing a report is perhaps not the best way to go about spreading information that you want people to engage with, and also updating a report can be quite difficult as well, and then having to distribute the report out again to all your colleagues. And then offer to talk to the intranet manager about making it available to everyone, so that is a reference tool that people can make use of whenever they wish. Now, the issue with doing that, if you read the passage properly and correctly, you might remember that there was a bit in the passage that said about the technical team are notoriously bad at spreading information across the business. So is it a great idea then to go to the intranet manager and making kind of him responsible for spreading that information across the business? Probably not. Whereas in 4, you're kind of taking that responsibility into your own hands, ensuring that's done successfully. So that's why 3, it really doesn't, it's not necessarily awful, but it just doesn't really grasp and solve the issue at hand. And if you're thinking about outcomes in the situation, 3 really isn't going to ensure that everyone in this business gets hold of the information that they need and engages with it in an effective way. So why 4 and 3? Now, this was a very, very difficult question. And the reason for this is because personally, I felt that each of 1, 2, 3, and 4, people could make a genuine case for saying why each of them was the best one. Now, this is something that's very difficult about situational judgment questions, is when the responses are so similar in their nature, and there isn't really one answer that's or creeping out or standing out at you as being the best or the worst one. And if you didn't get 4 and 3 as the correct answers, there's absolutely no shame in that, because this is a very difficult question. If you did, very well done. But I'm more concerned with you understanding how we've got to 4 and 3 and why 4 and 3 are the correct answers here. And to do this, it's so important to focus on outcomes. Now, I've talked about your final decision-making process in situational judgment tests should be focused obviously on what you'd actually do in the situation. It should be focused on how best does a response solve the issue at hand. And it should also focus on outcomes. Take an outcome-oriented approach to situational judgment questions and see if it works for you. By this, I mean, whenever you're reading a response, think, if I did this response, what would the likely effect be on this? And by that, I mean, what would the likely effect be on the whole scenario? Of course, it's hypothetical, and you might be thinking, how can I possibly know what the likely response would be, or the likely effect will be on the whole scenario? But you can just think this through in your head. And this time, I want you to focus on outcomes and see if it's any easier to arrive at the correct answer. So we'll try another situational judgment practice question. Now, this time it's more of a confrontational one, and there's more of a conflict in your company, which is a very common type of situational judgment scenario you will be presented with. In this case, it's not actually you with any conflict, it's 2 of your managers, 2 company directors who are having the conflict. So again, read through the passage quickly. I'm not going to go through it, but I am going to state the issue at hand here is that there's a disagreement between 2 senior members of staff, and problematically, that's not getting resolved, and it really needs your input for this issue to get resolved. So the issue is very simple in its nature compared to the last one that we had, but then again, it can be quite difficult to solve, I understand. So with that issue in mind, let's have a look at the responses. Now, you've got 4 responses, but this time you need to select not only the most effective and least effective, but also the second most and the third most. So you need to essentially rank these responses from 1 to 4, from what you think is most effective to least effective. Now you have 4 responses. Now have a look at these before I move on to the answers and the explanation. Now, them are the correct answers as follows. So D is the most effective, B is the second most, C is the third most, and A is the fourth most. Now, let's go through why each of those are in the order that they are in. And we'll focus on particularly on outcomes when we're doing this. So D, offer alternative solutions such as an online store. This would satisfy the need of increase distribution while requiring a smaller financial expense. Now think back to the passage. One of the fundamental problems at hand was conflicting objectives. The company didn't think they would be able to meet the retailer's expectations. However, the retailer wanted a certain amount of orders. So there's no real better way than what D is presenting. It's offering an alternative to what cannot happen essentially for the company. So an online store, it would satisfy the need to increase distribution, and it will lead to a small financial expense. So it kind of, the disagreement and the reason for why the 2 senior members of staff were angry was they were disagreeing on 2 different topics, and this solution of an online store will surely, if we're thinking about outcomes, make both of them senior members happy in terms of you're kind of satisfying both of their requests and opinions and making both of them happy. So thinking about outcomes, D would surely lead to the best outcome in this scenario, as you're trying to solve the issue between these 2 senior members, and the issue has stemmed from them not being able to come to an agreement about the company and the being able to meet the retailer's expectations. So offering something that will in turn have them agree on something is surely the best way to go about this situation. B is the second best, so that's saying request a meeting with the directors so that they can communicate their beliefs and concerns regarding this matter. Good, yeah, I think B's a good answer. The meeting will be a place where both directors can kind of discuss the concerns, and you're going to be present in case things become overheated and the meeting goes on in a rant or whatever. So B's good. However, I don't think it's as good as D necessarily, because you're kind of leaving it to the directors themselves to sort out their squabbling, and we know already that that hasn't worked. And at the end of the passage, it did say that your input was likely to be needed to help this issue be resolved. And if we think truly about outcomes, will be really that there's a chance that they will sit down together and they'll sort out, shake their hands, and everything will be cleared up. But the likelihood is, it's likely to not be resolved really. But then again, the logic behind the answer is still merit. There's still merit behind it, and it's not a dreadful answer by any means. The third most effective is C, which is after consideration of both directors' opinions, make a decision as to which of their strategies would be the most effective for the company and convey your apologies to the director with whom you do not agree. Now, there's two issues with C. Now, firstly, it's likely to not solve the conflict between the two managers. In fact, it's likely to make it worse between each other. And secondly, you're throwing yourself into the situation as well. So not only is it going to not solve and probably worsen the relationship between the two directors, it's probably going to create conflict between you and another director. So C really isn't a great way to go. For the company, I guess it's not too bad, as you're going about the decision for the company and you're progressing the company forward and putting the situation behind you. However, in terms of solving the issue at hand, solving the issue of the disagreement between the directors, it's not a great response by any means. And this is where focusing on outcomes really will help you to arrive at the correct answers. And finally, with A, the least effective response, allow the directors to come to a decision between them. After all, they will have the final say of whether you provide input or not. So as we know, that directors clearly cannot come to a decision between them. So leaving it to them probably isn't the greatest thing to do. The situation probably isn't going to get resolved this way. And this avoids the possibility of displeasing some of the most powerful people in the company. It seems does seem a bit of a lazy approach. And it seems like an approach that really isn't going to get the situation solved, as you're backing down yourself. You're not taking any initiative. You're not stepping forward to solve the issue at hand. You're leaving it to their directors. And if we think about the outcome, the likely outcome of A is that the relationship is going to worsen between the two directors, and they're not going to be able to solve the disagreement between them. Now, think to yourself, was the second question any easier? And by this, I mean not necessarily the responses or the scenario. Ignore that. I want you to think to yourself, was it easier to come to the correct answers or not? Now, if it wasn't, don't be alarmed. That's absolutely fine. But if you applied the logic of outcomes and went about the question that way, it should have been. So, with situation judgment questions, they are very tricky, and it's a stumbling block for many, many students. And it's so important for that reason to focus on outcomes and what you'd actually do, because one of the fundamental errors a lot of students make in situation judgment tests is they overcomplicate the situation more than it needs to be. They think about too many factors. For example, they think about what the company would want them to do in that situation. They think about what's the ethical thing to do. They think about trying to please everybody. it becomes complicated for yourself. You don't want to have to think of that many factors to consider. The only things you should be focusing on is outcomes and what you'd actually do in that situation. Tied in with that, which of these responses best helps solve the issue at hand. But again, that ties into outcomes. So really don't make situational judgment test questions and the process behind them any more difficult than they really need to be. Focus just on outcomes and what you would actually do in that situation. And as I said, answer honestly and just don't overcomplicate things. Once you've read the scenario, understood the issue at hand, read the responses, weighed up the responses, selected your responses, that's the time. Then it's the time to move on. There's no need to deliberate too much, read the responses over again. There's no need to do any of that. Just move on, carry on going, and you'll be fine in situational judgment tests as long as you follow the advice I've given you. Again, though, find an approach that works for you. If you're not comfortable taking an outcome-orientated approach to situational judgment test questions, then don't do it. As simple as that. Now, I'm just going to end this webinar with one crucial link, which is the Lancaster University Psychometric Test page resource link. And I'm not just promoting this link because it's a university link, but because it genuinely contains so many brilliant practice question resources on there, and everything you need really to have a go at more psychometric test questions. I just want to emphasize the importance of practice here. It really is the best way for you to improve at psychometric tests, and don't underestimate how much it can help you get better at them as well. So on the Lancaster University Psychometric Test page, you will see several resources on there. Graduates First is really good. Profiling for Success is really good as well. There's more links about halfway, 3/4 way down the page to different types of psychometric tests that we've discussed. And then there's also a link to the careers portal. And on Ab Integro, if you follow that link, there's some really good psychometric test resources on there. So if you follow that link and follow the different links on that site, there should be more than enough for you to have a go at, and an abundance of really good quality practice psychometric questions on there as well. So thank you for joining this webinar. I hope you found it useful. Like I said, practice as much as you can, and really best of luck with any psychometric tests that you have upcoming.